Hey guys, how's it going? So title of the video should be pretty self-explanatory. I was gonna put this off till I got back to my apartment so that I would have all the books I'm gonna talk about with me, but I was just so impatient, and kinda needed something to unwind, and so, here I am, my favorite books of 2017. So yeah, these are in no particular order or any sort of categorization. There is fiction and nonfiction and poetry on here. And I do have a few of the books with me, that I've read over the past week. So anyway, to start with, How It Is by Samuel Beckett. Another one of his strange novels, and which I never mentioned the fact that I was reading it on this channel. But this novel is about this man who is crawling through the mud, not really knowing what he's doing with his life. It's his internal monologue in a very weird stream of consciousness style, as many of other Beckett's novels are written. Eventually he meets this man named Pym, and he starts kind of whispering, or maybe not whispering, but talking about his own past life to Pym. And then eventually, in the third part of the novel, Pym leaves, and the main protagonist is left all alone to contemplate this life he is living, in which he crawls through the mud. And you find out that he has repeatedly, or supposedly repeatedly, done this, gone up to other people who are crawling through the mud and talked to them about his life, and others have come to him and talked to them about his life, which leaves open this ambiguity as to whether his life is his own life, because he might just be sort of reciting what other people in the mud have told him. And so it becomes this really fascinating testament to a very Beckett-esque form of nihilism, where, meaning, the world defies meaning. We're never going to find meaning, and that's very terrifying, but all we can really do is say yes to this confusing world. And so yeah, for that, I ended up loving it, and I was moved by it at times, because there are snippets in which you get a glimpse of what may have been this protagonist's past life when he wasn't crawling through the mud, and the juxtaposition of that with where he currently is, and contemplating how that is a metaphor for the lives we all live is kind of heartbreaking in a sense. But yeah, How It Is, definitely recommended. Next one is another Samuel Beckett. It's a play, Endgame. This was my grandpa's favorite Samuel Beckett play. I think I mentioned at some point that my grandfather was a Samuel Beckett scholar, and this was his favorite play by Beckett. And I had read Waiting for Godot a couple years ago, and it was my favorite by Samuel Beckett, even after the novels I'd read, until I'd read this. Yeah, so this is about a man named Ham and a man named Clove, and Ham cannot stand. He's perpetually sitting in a chair, and Clove cannot sit. He's perpetually walking around, and for some reason Clove is Ham's servant. And then, this all takes place in one home, in one room, actually, and in this room there are two trash cans, each with a person in them. And, basically, the way that I would sum this play up, if you know anything about Waiting for Godot, this is what would happen to Vladimir and Estragon if they finally realized that Godot is never coming. So even more bleak than Waiting for Godot. We aren't even waiting for anything. We're just bumming around, not knowing what to do with our lives, is sort of how I summed up this play. So yeah, Endgame. I really want to see a production of this. Next, may rank as the most pretentious entry on this list, I'm not sure, but the Iliad by Homer. No introduction needed. It's about the Trojan War. So many moving moments that will stick with me forever, and I'm desperate to reread this in a better translation. I didn't actually love the translation I read it in. I just found it very dry, and it fell flat a lot, but I have ordered on Amazon with one of the gift cards I got, the Robert Fitzgerald translation, which I think I'm going to love. I read a couple pages of it a while back, and I liked what I read. So I may be rereading it this year, but just, again, so many moving moments, so many moving human moments in this, elevated epic with these, larger-than-life heroes. So yeah, the Iliad. Next is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Maybe also ranks among the most pretentious entries here. So this is the story of Gilgamesh, who is the king of Uruk, and his friendship with a man named Enkidu. And the moment I found most moving in this epic, I wasn't expecting to be moved by this epic, but the most moving moment is after Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh has this huge monologue about how people experience the death of a loved one, and it was so true to life. It was just crazy how, thousands of years ago, people in Babylon were, still had these emotions that people in the 21st century can relate to. So yeah, I just thought it was so moving and fascinating too. Very philosophical. Gilgamesh goes on this whole quest to overcome death, essentially. And so there's a lot of philosophy in it too, but that moment was what really hit me. So yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Next, isn't really a book, it's an author. And you might see this coming, Shakespeare. Yeah, let's talk about Shakespeare. I lapped up so many of Shakespeare's plays like I would binge watch Game of Thrones. There is so much drama, and it's so entertaining. I mean, I read a book earlier this year that's not on this list, but I read a book where the person essentially said that, people went to Shakespeare's plays in his days like they now go to see, superhero movies. And I can see why, I think. There's drama, and just as much as the drama, there is a lot of philosophy in it, too. So that I just appreciated. And of course, I also appreciated the poetry. I just want to list off some of my favorite of Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet, of course, King Lear, Macbeth. Macbeth might be my absolute favorite, but I'm not sure. Antony and Cleopatra, probably in terms of just verse-by-verse poetry, Antony and Cleopatra is my absolute favorite. Measure for Measure, a fascinating play that is supposed to be a comedy, but doesn't seem very comical most of the time. Richard II, probably his most underrated play. Richard III, Much Ado About Nothing, The Merchant of Venice, and The Winter's Tale. I really enjoyed all of these. And next one, a one I just finished the other day, and which I was kind of expecting to love, but maybe didn't expect to love it even as much as I did, and this cover doesn't tell you much. Paradise Lost by John Milton. Yeah, so it's the story of how Satan was the, most glorious of all of God's angels, and decided that he wanted to try to overthrow God once he found out that he was being passed over for the kind of top seat in God's group for the Son of God, who would become Jesus, and tries to overthrow God and then is cast down to hell. And so Satan decides that he is going to ruin whatever God tries to do after he's been cast down, and this leads to the first sin of humankind, of Adam and Eve. And, while, Satan and Eve is the one of the two who actually eats of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, or the tree of good and evil. And she and Satan are ostensibly like the main villains of this epic, and yet they're also the most fascinating characters, and I think the most human characters. So that makes me wonder about like what John Milton actually thought of this. Did he perceive the fall of humankind as this awful thing, or was he in a certain sense praising it? I don't know. So anyway, I'm going to be rereading this year at some point. I think I might listen to it on an audiobook. I found an audiobook on YouTube of Patrick Stewart reading it, and that sounds awesome. So yeah, Paradise Lost, another classic that's a classic for a reason. And now I move into a slew of nonfiction. We have The New Trail of Tears by Naomi Shaefer Riley, which I talked about in depth in another video. But just a harrowing account of how Native Americans in the United States are doing right now, which is not very well, and such an important book. two big takeaways. One, Native Americans, despite having reservations that they live on, can't really do anything with the land that they own. And one particular small anecdote that Naomi Shaefer tells at one point that really has stuck with me is on this one reservation they needed to expand a school, and they couldn't build on the land around them. Just because of the terms of the contract of their ownership of the land, it was so difficult for them to actually be able to do anything on it that rather than expand this school outward and make it bigger, they just built a taller building. And she just talks about the ludicrousness of having this building that looks like a skyscraper in the middle of this almost barren reservation. And then second off, there just isn't a good education system in place on most reservations. She tells an anecdote in particular where she was in a school, the author was in a school with an administrator, and at one point, while the administrator was showing her around, the administrator asked her to wait a second because she wanted to help a student with an in-class assignment, like a math problem. And the answer that the administrator gave to the student to help them was the wrong answer, and the administrator didn't even realize it. So, how are these children to succeed if they aren't even being taught very well? So yeah, probably the bleakest book on this list. Next is, kind of keeping with the Native American theme, The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday, which is just an account of the mythology of the Kiowa. So you have these narrations of these various myths of, the Kiowa creation myth, how the Kiowa people came to be, how different customs came around, and then N. Scott Momaday juxtaposes these myths with historical events from the history of the Kiowa, such as the wars with the United States, maybe something about their traditions, like customs they had, and how they did war and all this stuff, how their social system was set up. And then he has anecdotes from his own life. And it was fascinating to look at this and see the connections between these three different different pieces from the Kiowa. The very mythological, elevated style, the just sort of dry historical facts, and then his own personal life and how these two other things played into his own life. So yeah, just fascinating, and I really wish that there was an N. Scott Momaday for every culture in the world. I would love to read a book like this about every other Native American nation, or about all the nations in Africa or nations in Asia, or wherever. I wish every culture had a book like this. So yeah, it was a great read, and I highly recommend it. Next is a bit more of a fun read. It's a memoir, Tis by Frank McCourt. This is the sequel to his more well-known memoir, Angela's Ashes. So Angela's Ashes is his story of growing up dirt poor in Limerick, Ireland. And then Tis picks up when he's about 19 and moves to the United States. And so it just tells the story of his 20s and his 30s. Basically, he spends a lot of his 20s bumming around, drifting from job to job. He joins the military for a while, eventually starts to go to school, becomes a teacher, gets married, has a daughter, gets divorced. So it's just his life, and I just marvel at how fun he can make, ostensibly boring anecdotes. Like he made this anecdote about going to see a production of Hamlet into this hilarious story. And yeah, it's just so much fun. And I think I related to it in particular because a lot of it is about his 20s. In that time in your 20s where you're kind of drifting and not knowing what you're doing with your life. And that's sort of where I am. So yeah, next is a book that may be surprising on this list, but it's Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom. I had mixed feelings about this book. I completely disagreed with the main thesis of it, which is, Harold Bloom has this main thesis in this book that Shakespeare invented the way that we think about being human in the modern world. And that, to me, is just based on a lot of faulty assumptions. Like, how can you really know how we think about being human in the modern world? And how do you know that there are things about being human in Shakespeare that weren't in any of the works of literature that came before him? So anyway, but just his passion for Shakespeare really came through, and just experiencing that, I think, got me into Shakespeare, and is why I was able to love Shakespeare in the way that I did. So I really appreciate that. And, you know, I appreciate Harold Bloom's passion for Shakespeare, and some of his insights are very interesting, even though I don't agree with all of them. It was still very interesting to grapple with the ones that I disagreed with, and the ones that I did agree with, I thought were very interesting. And then, to go along with that, I also read The Best Poems of the English Language, which was edited by Harold Bloom. And, so, kind of what it sounds like, just a anthology of poems of what Harold Bloom sees as the best poems, from, starting with Chaucer and ending with Robert Frost. And, what I think is particularly notable about the book is that he has kind of critical introductions to each poet. Yeah, a lot of them are just sort of a brief biographical portrait of the poet, but sometimes he will go in depth about a poem and actually analyze it a little bit, and maybe analyze the author's kind of overall oeuvre a little bit. And those in particular I found great. They helped me so much to appreciate the poems and to get me more into poetry in general. And I found so many poets who I want to explore more, and whom I love based on what I did read, you know, like Wallace Stevens. You know, I never read or liked Wallace Stevens until I read this anthology, or Hart Crane, or even Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare is in here, and you know, what Shakespeare here includes kind of maybe was a little bit of the impetus for me to start reading more Shakespeare this year. So yeah, I think it's a great anthology for just someone who wants to get into reading more poetry. And next is another book that I have that I finished earlier this week, and it's Mythology by Edith Hamilton. So just her sort of narration of a ton of Greek myths, you know, and she draws on a ton of sources. I kind of marvel at how many sources she drew on and wove together. You know, she draws on, obviously, you know, Homer and Hesiod, and like Virgil and Ovid, but also the great playwrights Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. And you know, you might think of this as just sort of a spark notes of like, you know, Homer and all these classics. But no, I think this has its own literary merits. Edith Hamilton was clearly a great storyteller, I think. You know, I so enjoyed experiencing the story of the Iliad in her version, or the story of the Odyssey, too, and many others. And she made me want to go back and reread those things, reread the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Virgil's Aeneid, and to read more of what I haven't read, like Euripides. I've read no Euripides. I've read all of Aeschylus and Sophocles, but no Euripides. And it made me want to go read the Epic of Jason and the Argonauts. So yeah, I just really love this. It really solidified my passion for Greek and Roman literature and myths. So yeah, definitely a new favorite. And then lastly is just a small, a slim volume of poetry. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow selected poems. Longfellow is a relatively easy poet, and so it was easy to appreciate, but you know, rather than go in depth, I thought I would just read my absolute favorite quote from this book, and possibly my favorite quote of the entire year. It's from the last poem in it, A Psalm of Life. So the quote is, "Let the dead past bury its dead." So yeah, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, definitely want to read more of him too. So yeah, it's been a great reading year, and it'll be really interesting to have my first full year on BookTube as a reader, and I really look forward to it. So yeah, and thank you to everyone for making it a wonderful second half of the year of reading. So, but yeah, anyway, everyone have a happy new year. Yeah, anyway, Bye, guys.